Everyone's worried about inflation. Everyone's worried about recession. But what happens when you get both at the same time? That's stagflation, and it's back in the headlines. The question is, why does it happen? And why do central banks always seem powerless to fix it? Today I'm going to break down stagflation through the Austrian lens and why the real solution is the opposite of what politicians and the Fed want you to believe. So stagflation is stagnant growth plus high unemployment plus inflation. Those are a terrible combination, and supposedly they all can't happen at the same time, according to Keynesians. They thought it was impossible since in their framework, inflation was supposed to mean growth, while unemployment was linked with deflation. So an example of this in the 1970s, the oil shocks, Nixon closing the gold window, loose monetary policy, all combined basically for the perfect storm. So stagflation isn't a paradox. It's a predictable outcome of government inflating money and basically distorting production and then trying to slam on the brakes. It's ridiculous. So the Austrian explanation for this is simple. It's boom and bust cycles. This is both widely written about and talked about by Mises and Hayek. You have artificially low rates that are fueling malinvestment. So you just take cheap money, and you take the cheap money and you're putting it into things that normally otherwise wouldn't get funding or investment, because the only reason they're getting the investment is because the money's so cheap. So there's the malinvestment, and then the resources flow into those unsustainable projects. And when those projects eventually fail, which they pretty much always do because they shouldn't have had the money in the first place, so then when you have the credit expansion, when that slows or reverses, those projects all of a sudden collapse. And it's like, what happened? Well, it's because only reason they were exactly in the beginning when they're funded is because they were just paid for with cheap money. Corporations take risks and put money into these crap projects that otherwise would never get the time of day because they would have a real world cost. And then obviously after these crappy investments belly up, of course unemployment rises because all this malinvestment goes away. All the meanwhile, inflation remains. And so the prior monetary expansion doesn't just disappear. Prices and wages are sticky. Expectations adjust upward. And people lose trust in the currency. And the result, the economy suffers both with structural unemployment and then currency devaluation. Keynesians believed in the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve showed the simple observation that inflation and employment moved in opposite directions. Keynesians turned it into like a policy tool. But stagflation in the 1970s kind of proved that wrong. So economists then, instead of admitting that they were wrong, they just kind of patched it over. That's what Keynesianism on a whole is patchwork. It's just slapping band-aids on things. You have Keynesianism and Austrian economics. Keynesianism is instant gratification, and I'm a toddler having a fit. I want now. And Austrian economics is delayed gratification and adult being an adult and saving for the future and building for the future. So that's the main difference. Breaking those two down in the most simple way possible, that's it. So the idea is that there's a stable trade-off between inflation and unemployment. More inflation leads to less unemployment, and less inflation leads to more unemployment. So when the 1970s hit, this trade-off totally collapsed, and people weren't fooled by the money printing anymore. They expected prices to keep rising, and so inflation stayed high while unemployment also climbed. So eventually it led to the creation of the Phillips curve with expectations. So they had to, Keynesians often basically they just keep adjusting after the fact when their silly theories fall flat and are completely wrong. And Austrians have no need for a patch. They had explained this decades earlier. Ludwig von Mises talked about it in length. Quote, "Credit expansion can bring about a temporary boom, but such a fictitious prosperity must end in a general depression of trade, a slump, and a crisis." End quote. Basically, in other words, inflationary booms don't prevent recessions, they guarantee deeper ones in the future. Keynesianism is just, it's like a drunkard, and you're drinking and you're drunk, you feel great, and to prolong and put off the hangover, you just keep drinking and you keep it going, because you're going to have to keep drinking more and more to keep getting that same feeling. But we all know that the worse the hangover is going to be if you continue doing that once you stop drinking. So once you stop pumping the money in, that's when problems really occur. But inflation's still remaining a little sticky, which happens. It's the effects of things don't happen generally for 12 to 18 months, sometimes afterwards. Gold is hitting record highs. Bond yields are spiking. Markets are flashing red. But the Fed is stuck. They kind of find themselves in a rock and hard place here, because if they cut rates, they're going to risk reigniting inflation. But if they keep rates too high, they're going to risk more unemployment and the debt strain. The political pressure keeps rising, especially when elections are coming up. And it shouldn't 12 people shouldn't be deciding the rate of what money costs. It should be done by the free market. So these are pretty much textbook stagflation conditions here. Stop inflating. Just stop inflating. End the artificial credit expansion. If we stop pumping money and just stop creating money out of nothing and putting it into the system, we just need to stop inflating, end the credit expansion. And yes, it's going to be a temporary, short-term pain, but the long-term gain is going to be amazing if we come back to sound money. We can clear the markets of all this malinvestment and this bad debts that we have going around. They need to be liquidated. Short-term pain is inevitable. It's going to happen, but at least we can choose when it's going to happen, and we know it's going to be short-term. But if we keep pumping up the system and keeping it going, then it's going to have a much larger awful effect down the road. We want long-term prosperity, and that requires honest money and real savings, not manipulation from the Fed constantly. The markets need to be left alone. So stagflation is not a mystery. It's an inevitable outcome of decades of monetary manipulation, and the Keynesians want you to believe it's oil shocks and supply chains. But the Austrian answer is clear. When you destroy money, you destroy growth, period. So here's my question for you. If you were in charge of the Fed right now, what would you do? Would you raise rates, lower rates, or do nothing? Doing nothing is probably the best thing the Fed can do, so that way the market reacts to reality, not what they are dictating. So drop your answers in the comments, and if you guys liked the video, found any value in it at all, please subscribe, like, and share it with a friend. It really helps the channel grow, and I'll see you in the next video.